Archie Goodwin here. Welcome back to Riddle Stop. Now I could tell you today's story is about a shipping heiress hiring a private detective to look into a shipboard accident, but that's like calling 10 years at the bottom of the Java Sea a filing delay. A business partner found dead in a salvage barge's forward hold on a flat, calm night. From a wound, the local police were a little too quick to call a fall. A widow who kept a photograph of 4 young men in tropical whites for 6 years without knowing why her husband could never look at it straight on, and finally asked us to find out. A records clerk who catalogued a water-damaged manifest for weeks without once questioning why a crate of orchids weighed as much as a grown man twice over. A dive supervisor who's carried a stranger's betrayal on a cord around his neck since 1943, waiting to find out whose face belonged to it. A collector who chased a decade-old rumor 11,000 miles and never once asked what else might be sharing a crate with the thing he wanted. A respectable marine engineer with a spotless reputation, a new surname, and 10 years of careful distance between himself and a country he swore he'd never set foot in again. A young diver nearly killed by an air hose everybody was a little too quick to call ordinary wear. Fritz Brenner, back on West 35th Street, spent the whole 6 weeks convinced a stranger loitering on the stoop was the tensest moment of this case. He wasn't even close. And then there's the detail nobody counted on. A false bottom built into a botanist's shipping crate before it ever left port. A ledger sealed in wax that survived what the sea couldn't. And a signature under a name its owner buried the same year he buried everyone who might have recognized it. So get comfortable. This one's called Nero Wolfe and the Java Sea Salvage. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Orchid That Shouldn't Exist. It was a Wednesday in June, which matters only because I want it on record that nothing about this case began on a Tuesday or a Thursday, and if you knew Nero Wolfe you'd understand why that detail earns a sentence of its own. I was at my desk in the office at 918 West 35th Street, reconciling the germination records for a batch of Miltenia seedlings, when the doorbell rang its 2 short notes and Fritz's footsteps crossed the hall with the particular unhurried dignity he reserves for expected visitors. I heard Caesar's low acknowledgement from the front room, not a bark, just a rumble in the chest that means I know this one, and a moment later, Fritz ushered in a small, sharp-eyed man in a grey suit that had been pressed within an inch of its life, carrying a leather portfolio case against his chest like it might try to escape. "Mr. Kessler," Fritz said, and withdrew. I knew Otto Kessler by reputation before I knew him by sight, the most trusted orchid broker on the eastern seaboard. A man who had once told a Long Island Railroad baron that his entire Cattleya collection was fraudulent and been proven right within the month. Wolfe did business with him the way other men do business with their doctors, reluctantly, and only because the alternative was worse. Wolfe was up in the plant rooms. It was 10:40, well inside his sacred 9 to 11, and I told Kessler as much. "I'll wait," Kessler said, and sat down like a man prepared to wait until Christmas. He waited 40 minutes, which is the kind of thing that tells you something about a visitor before he said 10 words. When the elevator groaned and Wolfe's 1/7 of a ton came through the office door at 11:06, orchid-scented and unhurried, Kessler was on his feet before Wolfe had cleared the threshold. "Mr. Wolfe, forgive the intrusion on your hour. I wouldn't have come without word first. Except the word came to me too fast to trust to a telephone call, and I know how you feel about telephones for anything that matters." Wolfe lowered himself into the chair built to hold him, and regarded Kessler with the flat patience he keeps in reserve for people who are about to waste his time, or occasionally people who are not. "Sit, Mr. Kessler. Say what you've come to say, and say it without decoration. I have 4 hours before I need think about lunch, and I intend to spend at least one of them believing you were worth the interruption." Kessler sat, opened the portfolio, and did not take out a single piece of paper. Instead he said, "Do you know the name Aldous Farrand?" Wolfe's eyes, which are rarely more than half open in the mornings on principle, opened the rest of the way. The botanist, Dutch father, French mother, Leiden trained, vanished from professional circles in 1946 and was presumed dead shortly after. He is chiefly remembered, when he is remembered at all, for a monograph on Bornean Paphiopedilum that promised more than it delivered, and for a rumor that has been circulating in orchid circles for a decade and has never once been substantiated. "The genus," Kessler said. "With the genus," Wolfe agreed. and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard in some years. Not quite hunger, because Wolfe would consider hunger an indignity to admit to over anything but food, but its cousin. I'll explain the rumor the way Kessler explained it to Wolfe, because I had to have it explained to me twice before I understood why a grown man built like a Buick would care. In 1946, before he disappeared, Aldous Ferrand had written to 3 colleagues, one in Leiden, one in Kew, one in New York, claiming he had located in the high forest above a river valley in Dutch Borneo a slipper orchid, unlike any recorded genus. Not a new species, a new genus. The kind of find that happens to a botanist perhaps once in a discipline's lifetime, if it happens at all. He'd promised specimens, living and pressed, on his return passage to Amsterdam. He never arrived. The ship he'd booked passage on, a Dutch-registered freighter called the Willem Card, went down in a typhoon in the Java Sea in March of 1947, 6 months after his letters, with all hands and cargo lost in 12 fathoms of water off the Kalimantan coast. For 10 years, the genus had been a ghost, a footnote, a story orchid men told each other over brandy, the way sailors tell each other about sea serpents. The wreck's been found, Kessler said, located this spring by a Singapore salvage outfit working a Dutch backer's money. They've begun bringing up cargo. I had it from a man in Amsterdam who has it from a man on the salvage crew. There's a hold, sealed and apparently airtight when they breached it. That was logged on the original manifest under General Botanical Freight, Ferrand's collection. If any part of it survived 12 fathoms and 10 years, Mr. Wolfe, it would be the single most significant orchid recovery of this century. Wolfe sat very still. I've seen him sit still over a body in the office and show less of what was going on behind his eyes than he showed sitting still over that sentence. You believe this account is reliable, he said at last. I believe it's reliable enough that if I didn't bring it to you and someone else got there first, you'd never forgive me for it, Kessler said, which struck me as an honest answer, and from what I came to know of Kessler, probably the only kind he gave. Wolfe closed his eyes. When he opened them again, his voice had gone back to its usual register, flat, unbothered, a man discussing the weather. It is nothing to me. A rumor a decade old, a wreck at the bottom of a sea, 11,000 miles from this room, and cargo that has spent 10 years being consumed by salt water and whatever organisms find orchid tissue palatable. I am obliged to you for the visit, Mr. Kessler, but I have 400 Cattleya under glass upstairs that require no salvage operation to admire. Kessler stood, gathered his portfolio, and I'll give the man credit, did not push. Of course, Mr. Wolfe, I only thought you'd want to know before the story reached the trade papers. He let himself out. I waited until the front door closed and Caesar's low acknowledgement sounded again. Farewell this time, before I said anything. You're going to think about it, I said. I think about a great many things I have no intention of acting upon. Sure, same way you thought about that orchid poacher in '52 for 6 weeks before you had Saul on a boat to Guatemala inside of 2 days. Wolfe picked up his book, a Balzac he'd been picking up and setting down for a fortnight, and did not open it. He held it the way a man holds a hand of cards he hasn't decided whether to play. Archie, he said, bring me the file on Dutch East Indies shipping registries, if one exists. One doesn't exist. Not in this house. Then find where one does. I grinned at him, which he ignored, and went to the phone. Chapter 2. A fee too strange to refuse. I didn't get far with the shipping registries. The New York Public Library's collection on Dutch colonial maritime records turned out to be thinner than a Sunday sermon on gluttony, before the case solved the problem of getting Wolfe interested by walking in through the front door on its own 2 feet, 4 days later, in the form of a letter, and 20 minutes after the letter, a woman. The letter came by messenger, on stationery heavy enough to stop a bullet, from a Margit Holloway of Sutton Place. I read it standing in the hall because Wolfe was at his desk finishing the crossword and had made it clear he did not wish to be disturbed for anything less than a fire. Dear Mr. Wolfe, I understand you have already heard, from another quarter, of the salvage operation now underway on the wreck of the Willem Cade. I am the principal financial backer of that operation. I am writing to ask you to take on an investigation connected with it. Not the cargo, though I understand the cargo interests you for reasons of your own, but a murder. 3 days ago, aboard the salvage barge anchored above the wreck site, A man named Cornelis Decker was found dead in the forward hold where recovered cargo is inventoried. Mr. Decker was my late husband's business partner and had come out to the Java Sea at my request to oversee the cataloguing of items recovered from the wreck. Among them, I am told, whatever remains of a certain botanist specimen collection that I understand is of interest to you. The local authorities have called it an accident, a fall against recovered cargo, in poor light on a rolling deck. I do not believe it, and I do not believe it for reasons I would rather explain to you in person than commit to a letter that might be read by other eyes before it reaches yours. I am prepared to pay whatever fee you require and to arrange passage, private, comfortable, and swift for you and whatever staff you require aboard my own yacht to the Java Sea. I understand this is an unusual request to make of a man who I am told does not care to leave his own street. I make it regardless, because I believe you are the only investigator in either hemisphere capable of untangling what I suspect is buried in that wreck alongside the Orchids. I will call at 11:30 tomorrow morning, if that is convenient, to discuss terms. Yours, Margaret Holloway. I brought it in and set it on Wolfe's desk without a word, because I know when a piece of paper will do my arguing for me. He read it once. He read it a second time, more slowly, and I watched him get to the word yacht and go very still in the particular way he goes still when something has landed in his lap that he hasn't decided yet whether to resent or want. Preposterous, he said, and set it down. Sure. I do not travel, Archie. You know this. I have not left the state of New York in 11 years. I know. I was there for the last time, and so was the bullet that nearly parted your hair, which is probably why you haven't tried it since. He glared at me, which I took as a sign of progress, because a man who intends to refuse something outright doesn't usually bother glaring at the person pointing out his reasons. She wants a murder solved 11,000 miles from this office, aboard a boat, in a jurisdiction where I know no law, no customs, and no language beyond a schoolboy's Malay I have not exercised since I was 12 years old. And a hold full of maybe orchids that might make you the most famous man in the Cattleya Society since whoever discovered the Cattleya. That is incidental.
Sure it is.
He picked up the letter a third time. I've known Wolfe the better part of 20 years, and I can generally read him the way a man reads a familiar road. But I'll admit I didn't know, watching him read that letter for the third time, which way this one was going to break. Mrs. Holloway arrived the next morning at 11:30 exactly, which I noted because punctuality in a client usually means either genuine urgency or a personality that treats other people's time as a resource to be managed, and I wasn't yet sure which I was looking at. She was somewhere past 40 and handling it the way expensive tailoring handles most things, by simply refusing to acknowledge the problem. Diana caught her scent from the front hall before Fritz had the door fully open and gave the particular low, uneasy note she reserves for people carrying something heavier than their manners let on. Grief, maybe. Or fear. Diana doesn't file a written report. She just tells you there's something and lets you find out what. Wolfe kept her waiting the statutory 2 minutes, enough to establish that he operates on his own clock. Not long enough to be an insult, before he had Fritz bring her in. She sat where Kessler had sat 4 days earlier, in the red leather chair, and got straight to business in a voice that had been trained somewhere to sound calmer than its owner felt. My husband died 6 years ago, Mr. Wolfe. David and Cornelis Decker built a shipping concern together before the war, freight lines through the Indies, mostly. My husband was in Batavia when the Japanese came in 42. He didn't come home until 45, and when he did, he wasn't the same man, and he never told me everything about the years between. He died of a heart attack in 1950, and I have always believed the heart in question had been damaged long before any doctor got near it, with a stethoscope. You believe the war did it, Wolfe said. Grief is not evidence, madam. No, but this might be. She opened her handbag and produced a single photograph, worn soft at the corners, and set it on Wolfe's desk. It showed 4 men in tropical whites, arms over each other's shoulders, squinting into a hard equatorial sun. Young, all of them, the way every photograph from before a war makes its subjects look young even when they weren't. My husband is on the left. Cornelis is beside him. The other 2 I cannot name. David never would tell me, though I asked more than once, and each time I asked he looked like a man being asked to reopen a wound that had only half closed. That photograph was in his desk when he died. I found it again 3 weeks ago, going through papers I hadn't touched in years, because the salvage company had just written to say they'd located the wreck, and I remembered David once saying, just once, half drunk, the only time I ever heard him mention the Willem Cade by name, that there was a debt on that ship that would sink some man's reputation a great deal deeper than the ship itself had sunk. The office was quiet, except for the tick of the clock, and, faintly, Fritz's knife against a cutting board somewhere back in the kitchen. "And now Mr. Decker is dead," Wolfe said. "Now Mr. Decker is dead aboard the barge, in the hold where the recovered cargo is being catalogued, 3 days after the salvage crew opened a hold that had been sealed since The local authorities, a Dutch colonial police, stretched thin and eager to close the file before the monsoon season complicates their salvage permits. I do not believe Cornelis fell, Mr. Wolfe. I believe he found something in that hold that someone else needed to stay lost, and I believe that someone is still aboard that barge, cataloguing cargo, and waiting to see whether anyone else comes looking." Wolfe was silent long enough that I started composing, in my head, the polite version of the refusal I was sure was coming. "My fee," he said instead, "for a case of this nature, international travel, an unfamiliar jurisdiction, and demands upon my time I would ordinarily refuse to entertain at any price, would be considerable." "Name it." He named it. It was a figure that would have made a Wall Street man reach for his handkerchief. Mrs. Holloway didn't blink. Additionally, Wolfe said, "I will require passage for myself and Mr. Goodwin, and very possibly a third man, aboard a vessel I find adequate, on terms I will specify once I have seen it. I will require that any specimens recovered from the botanical hold, living, pressed or otherwise preserved, be released into my custody for identification and safekeeping before any other party, including yourself, examines them." "Agreed." "And I will require," Wolfe said, and here his voice dropped a register, I recognized as the sound of a man committing himself to something he already half regretted. "Several days to arrange matters at this house before I can depart. I do not undertake voyages lightly, Mrs. Holloway, and I have obligations here that cannot simply be abandoned." I thought about the plant rooms. I thought about 6 dogs. I thought about Fritz's face when he heard this. I said nothing, because some victories are best left unnarrated in front of the client. Mrs. Holloway rose, shook Wolfe's reluctant hand, and left with the particular lightness of a woman who has just watched an immovable object agree to move. When the door closed behind her, I turned around. "You're really doing this?" "I am agreeing to investigate a murder," Wolfe said, with the dignity of a man who has decided to pretend the last 10 minutes concerned only justice. "The location is regrettable, and the orchids are incidental. Archie," he picked his book back up, "go find out what kind of boat this woman keeps, and whether it has a decent galley. I will not cross an ocean to starve." Chapter 3. Provisions for a Reluctant Voyage. The week that followed was, in its way, more harrowing than anything that happened once we actually reached the Java Sea, because it required me to watch Nero Wolfe attempt to pack for a voyage, and a man who has not left the state of New York in 11 years does not pack so much as he mounts a defensive campaign against the very idea of travel. Theodore Horstman took the news the way you'd expect a man to take news that his employer intended to abandon 4,000 orchid plants at the height of the flowering season for a journey of unspecified duration to the opposite side of the planet. He didn't shout. Theodore never shouts. He simply goes very correct and very cold, the way certain people get more dangerous the quieter they become, and he spent 2 full days compiling a notebook of instructions, so exhaustive that I privately suspected he intended it to also serve as evidence, in the event Wolfe returned to find the collection in ruins, of exactly whose fault that would be. "You will not repot the Miltania hybrids while I am away," Wolfe told him, on the last evening, standing in the warm room among the odontoglossum with the particular stiffness of a general reviewing troops he expects never to see again. "You will maintain the humidity schedule precisely as recorded. You will not, under any circumstance, Theodore, and I mean this with the full weight of everything you know about my temperament, you will not experiment." "I have never experimented, Mr. Wolfe," Theodore said, in a voice that suggested he had in fact experimented on at least one memorable occasion, and both men knew it, and neither intended to relitigate it 4 days before an ocean voyage. Fritz took it differently. Fritz took it the way Fritz takes everything that threatens the smooth operation of the house, with a face gone carefully blank and a great deal of extremely aggressive cooking. He fed us, in the 5 days before departure, as though he were fattening us for a siege, and I understood, watching him do it, that this was simply how the man said the things he wasn't going to say out loud. He packed into a hamper the size of a steamer trunk enough tinned pâté, dried sausage, and hard cheese to reprovision a small navy, along with a letter sealed addressed to Wolfe, not to be opened until the yacht was 3 days out, that I never did learn the contents of, though I noticed Wolfe read it alone in his cabin the first night at sea, and did not come up for dinner. The dogs were the worst of it. I don't mind saying so. Caesar took the packing calmly, the way he takes most things, patrolling the hall with his usual gravity as trunks came down from the box room, as though satisfied that whatever was happening had been properly authorized because Wolfe himself was overseeing it. Mars was more agitated, circling the luggage with his ears back, throwing the occasional low growl at nothing in particular, the way he does when his sense of the house's order is disturbed, and he hasn't yet identified the culprit. Apollo simply patrolled harder, doubling his usual circuits of the ground floor, as though he could somehow patrol his way back to normalcy. Minerva sat in the hall doorway for the better part of an afternoon, watching Wolfe's cabin trunk get carried down the stairs, her head tracking it the way she tracks a stranger she hasn't decided yet whether to trust, and I had the distinct impression, fanciful as it sounds, that she understood exactly what a trunk that size meant, and didn't care for the implications. Diana sensed the whole household's unease before any of us had said a word about it, and spent 2 days unusually quiet, pressed against Fritz's leg in the kitchen more often than not. Loyal was the one that got me. He'd found Wolfe's traveling case on the second-to-last evening, sitting open on the office floor while Wolfe decided what books he could and could not live without for 6 weeks, and he'd simply lain down beside it. Not on it, not in the way of it. Beside it, chin on his paws, watching Wolfe move around the room with the same steady, patient attention he must have given the road on that 200-mile walk that first brought him to this house, back when he still belonged to a man named Jonathan Blackwood, who never made it home. I've told you Loyal doesn't make a show of things. He didn't make a show of this either. He just stayed by that case. And when Wolfe finally noticed him there, something crossed Wolfe's face that I choose not to describe further, because Wolfe would not thank me for it, and because some things a man does for a dog belong to the man and the dog, and nobody else. On the last morning, all 6 of them saw us to the door, Caesar and Mars flanking the hallway like an honor guard, Apollo and Diana at the window watching the car arrive, Minerva sitting apart with her particular watchful stillness, and Loyal pressed against Wolfe's leg the whole walk from the office to the stoop, until Wolfe crouched, an operation that cost him some dignity and no small effort, and put a hand on the dog's head for a long moment without saying anything at all. 6 weeks, Fritz, Wolfe said, straightening. No longer. If it runs longer than that, I expect you to wire Mrs. Holloway's office and inform her I have reconsidered the entire arrangement. Yes, sir, Fritz said, and I noted that his voice, ordinarily as steady as a metronome, wavered on the second word. We left the brownstone at 9 in the morning, under a sky the flat grey of a Manhattan June. And I'll confess that I looked back at it once, from the car, the way you look back at a house you're not entirely sure will still be standing, or still be the same house when you finally get back to it. Margit Holloway's yacht, the Wandering Star, was 140 feet of teak and brass, moored at a private slip on the East River, crewed by 11 men and a captain named Halstead, who had the look of someone who had seen a great many strange things carried aboard his ship and had trained himself not to remark on any of them, which was fortunate, because the sight of Nero Wolfe coming up the gangway, moving like a man crossing a minefield, wasn't something I'd have wanted remarked upon either. He made it aboard. He stood on the deck a moment, one hand on the rail, looking back at the receding line of Manhattan with an expression I couldn't read and didn't try to. Well, Archie, he said finally, we are apparently going to sea. Apparently we are, I said, and went to find out where they'd stowed Fritz's hamper. Chapter 4. The Wreck at 12 Fathoms. I won't pretend the crossing was uneventful, because 6 weeks is a long time to keep a man like Nero Wolfe entertained on a boat, and I spent the better part of the Atlantic leg fielding his complaints about the food, adequate though he wouldn't admit it, the mattress, an outrage, and the fundamental unreasonableness of an ocean that insisted on moving under a man who had built his entire life around staying still. He read. He played chess against Saul Panzer, whom he'd wired to join us in Lisbon, and who turned out to have a surprising aptitude for losing gracefully, which is a rarer talent than winning gracefully, and one Wolfe appreciated more than he'd have admitted. He did not once in 6 weeks, set foot on deck after dark, and he took his meals in his cabin more often than not, and twice I heard him, through the cabin wall, in a conversation with nobody, working through some botanical taxonomy problem out loud the way another man might talk through a crossword. We reached the salvage site on a hot, flat morning in late July. The barge and its support vessels anchored in a stretch of green-grey water off the Kalimantan coast, with the low green line of the Bornean shore visible to the south, and somewhere beneath us, 12 fathoms down, the Willem Card resting exactly where the typhoon had put her 10 years before. Wolfe stood at the rail of the Wandering Star, a genuine concession, that, the first time I'd seen him voluntarily near an open rail since Lisbon, and looked at the water for a long moment. 12 fathoms, he said, 72 feet, close enough to the surface for hard-hat divers to work in shifts without excessive decompression risk, and yet far enough that anything left unrecovered for a decade would have every reasonable expectation of staying lost. He turned to me. Archie, I do not intend to go any nearer that water than this rail. I trust you understood that before we left New York. I understood it before we left the driveway, I said, and I want it on the record that I meant it kindly. He was as good as his word. In the 11 days we spent anchored off that wreck site, Nero Wolfe never once went below the barge's main deck to where the diving operations were staged, never once looked over the side at the water with anything but the flattest and most theoretical curiosity, and conducted the entirety of his investigation from a deck chair positioned at his specific instruction as far from the rail as the available deck space allowed. With an awning rigged over his head by Halstead's crew to keep the equatorial sun off him, and a small folding table beside him for his beer, which Fritz's foresight had ensured a case of had made the crossing intact. It made, I'll admit, a genuinely comic picture. The fat man in the deck chair under the awning, conducting a murder investigation on a salvage barge without so much as glancing at the operation itself, and more than one member of the crew took a moment, in those first days, to size him up and privately conclude they were dealing with either a fraud or a fool. They revised that opinion inside of a week. I watched them revise it. The barge itself was a working vessel, not built for comfort, a flat-decked recovery ship, with a crane amidships, air compressors chugging away to feed the divers below, and a forward hold that had been converted into a cataloguing office, crates and recovered cargo laid out on trestle tables under electric lights run off the ship's generator. It was in that hold, 3 tables in from the door, that Cornelis Decker had died. Margit Holloway met us at the barge's boarding ladder. She'd come out from her shore quarters in Balikpapan the day before, and she looked in the hard tropical light, older and more strained than she had in Wolfe's office, the way a client's face always seems to age between the hiring and the hunting. She introduced us over the course of that first afternoon to the people who mattered. Hendrik Lawrence, the salvage's marine engineer, and effectively its operational commander, a lean, sun-cured Dutchman somewhere past 50, with the particular economy of movement of a man who has spent decades on working vessels and has learned to waste nothing, including words. He ran the salvage the way Wolfe ran the brownstone, as an absolute domain, and he did not care for the presence of a private detective aboard his barge, and said so once plainly before dropping the subject entirely and never raising it again, which struck me even then as either genuine professionalism or the discipline of a man very carefully controlling his temper. Mr. Adrianus Bregman, the colonial records clerk seconded from the Netherlands Indies Archive in Batavia to catalogue whatever came up from the wreck against the original 1947 manifest, a small, precise, ink-stained man who seemed happiest with a document in front of him and visibly uncomfortable anywhere near the actual water. Ari Ontawirio, the dive supervisor, Bornean-born, who had worked salvage and pearling boats up and down that coast since before the war, and who wore, on a cord around his neck, a small brass button that I later learned had come off a Japanese officer's tunic, and that he touched, without apparent awareness he was doing it, whenever the war came up in conversation. Julian Marsh, an English collector and dealer, who had attached himself to the operation the moment word of the botanical hold leaked into the trade, ostensibly there to advise on preservation of any surviving specimens. Actually there, I'd have bet money, because he'd smelled the same rumor Kessler had smelled, and had gotten to the coast faster than Wolfe had. And, standing a little apart from the others, watching us with the particular wariness of a woman who has recently discovered that a colleague's death might not have been an accident, Margit Holloway herself, who introduced everyone with brisk efficiency, and then took Wolfe and me aside once the pleasantries were done, and walked us to the forward hold. It was hot in there, and smelled of salt and machine oil, and faintly of something underneath that I didn't examine too closely. 3 trestle tables ran the length of the space, laid with recovered cargo in various states of salt ruin, bronze fittings, a scatter of colonial-era porcelain, a stack of ledgers gone soft and mottled with water damage, a wooden crate, larger than the others, stenciled with a faded shipping code, and beneath it, in smaller letters that had somehow survived a decade of seawater better than anything around it, Ferrand, botanical, handle upright. Wolfe looked at that crate for a long moment, from the doorway, without approaching it. "That is where he died," Mrs. Holloway said, and pointed to the space between the second and third tables. Face down, a single wound to the back of the skull. Consistent, the local police said. With a fall against the edge of that table there, the corner's iron-bound, you can see it's sharp enough. But Cornelis was not a clumsy man. Mr. Wolfe, and the light in here at the hour he died was electric and adequate, and I do not believe a man falls hard enough to kill himself against a table corner on a deck that wasn't even rolling that night. The sea was flat calm. I checked the log myself. Wolfe finally moved into the hold, walked its length once, slowly, and stopped at the Ferrand crate. He did not touch it. He looked at the stenciled letters for a long moment, and then at the iron-bound table corner Mrs. Holloway had indicated, and then, unexpectedly, up at the electric light fixture overhead. "Archie," he said, "the manifest. I want to see the original 1947 manifest, and I want to see it before I see anything else on this vessel." Chapter 5. Faces off the coast of Batavia. Bregman produced the manifest without complaint. He seemed, if anything, relieved to have a reason to retreat to his own small desk in the corner of the hold, away from the crate and the memory of what had happened between the tables. And Wolfe spent the better part of 2 hours going through it, sheet by water-stained sheet, while I made myself useful talking to everyone else who'd been aboard the night Decker died. I'll give you the gallery the way I built it, piece by piece, over those first days, because that's how a case like this comes together, not all at once, but in fragments. The way Arion Tawirio's brass button caught the light differently depending on how he was standing. Hendrik Lawrence ran a tight operation and did not pretend otherwise. He'd been salvaging wrecks in the Indies and the South China Sea for nearly 20 years, he told me, over a cigarette on the barge's stern rail on my second evening aboard, and he'd heard every kind of rumor about every kind of wreck, and the Willem Cade was, as far as he was concerned, just another job, a good one, a well-paying one, backed by a client with deep pockets and an unusual personal stake, but a job. When I asked him about the night Decker died, his account was clean and unadorned. He'd been on the bridge with the night watch until nearly midnight, checking weather reports against the following day's dive schedule, and hadn't gone near the forward hold at all. 2 of his crew backed the account. It held together the way a well-told story holds together, which is to say perfectly, perhaps a shade too perfectly for a man recounting an ordinary evening rather than an alibi. Adrianus Bregman had been at his desk in the hold until nearly 11, cataloguing the day's recovered cargo against the manifest, and had left, he said, before Decker himself came down to do the same work on the late shift, a habit of Decker's, apparently, working alone in the cool of the evening once the compressors shut down for the night. Bregman's hands, I noticed, shook faintly whenever the manifest came up in conversation, though whether that was grief, guilt, or simply a fussy man's discomfort with disorder, I couldn't yet say. Arion Tawirio had been below with the night diving crew, servicing airlines for the next day's descent, and had, he told me, with the particular flatness of a man who has learned not to show more feeling than the moment requires, heard nothing out of the ordinary until the shout went up that Decker had been found. When I asked him gently about the brass button he wore, he touched it without seeming to notice he had, and told me only that he'd taken it off a dead man in 1943, and that he didn't care to say more, and I didn't press him, because there are some doors in a man's history you knock on once and then leave alone until he's ready to open them himself. Julian Marsh was the easiest man aboard to dislike and the hardest to pin down in the way of collectors the world over, charming in the specific, transactional way of a man who has learned that charm opens doors that money alone will not, and entirely unbothered by the presence of a dead body 3 tables away from a botanical crate he plainly wanted very badly. He'd heard about the wreck, he told me cheerfully, through the usual channels, which I took to mean the same trade gossip that had reached Kessler, and had made his own way to the Indies inside of a fortnight, ahead of Wolfe by nearly a week, and had spent that week, by his own admission, trying to get Lawrence to let him examine the Ferrand crate before it was formally catalogued. Lawrence, to his credit, had refused. Margit Holloway, for her part, spent those first days in a state of controlled, exhausted vigilance, and it was on the 3rd evening, over a dinner Wolfe had grudgingly agreed to take on deck, rather than in his cabin, the sunset over the Bornean coast being, I think, the first thing about the voyage he'd actually enjoyed without complaint, that she told us the rest of what she knew. David never spoke about the occupation years, she said, turning her wine glass without drinking from it. Not once, in all our marriage, except that one time, and even then only in pieces. I know he was in Batavia when the Japanese came. I know Cornelis was with him. I know there was a group resistance, I suppose you'd call it, though David never used that word. He always just called them the others, and I know that group was betrayed sometime in 1943, and that most of them didn't survive the war because of it. David did. Cornelis did. I don't know how, and I never asked, because every time the subject came near that year, David's whole face would change, and I loved him too much to make him wear that expression more than the war already had. And you believe, Wolfe said, that the betrayal and the wreck and Mr. Decker's death are connected? I believe, Mrs. Holloway said, that David once told me, drunk, at 3 in the morning, the only time in 20 years of marriage I ever saw him properly drunk, that the man who betrayed them was paid for it, paid in things, not money, things that could be carried and hidden and moved, and that some of what that man was paid with went onto a ship in 1947, headed for Amsterdam, because he needed it out of the Indies before the wrong people started asking the right questions. And I believe, Mr. Wolfe, that if any part of that cargo has survived in that hold for 10 years, then the man who arranged for it to be shipped is either aboard this barge right now, watching to see whether its surface is intact, or has someone aboard watching for him. Wolfe was silent for a long moment, looking out at the darkening water where, invisible below, the Willem Cade had been resting on its secret for a decade. Mrs. Holloway, he said finally, I will need the names of every man known to have survived that resistance cell, and every man known to have died in its betrayal, cross-referenced, if such records exist, against everyone currently aboard this vessel or connected to this salvage operation. It is possible, likely even, that the man we are looking for has spent 10 years quietly becoming someone else. Chapter 6. What the Tide Brought Up. The records took 4 days to assemble, most of that time spent with Bregman digging through what remained of the Colonial Archive's wartime files in Batavia by wire and courier, and in those 4 days someone tried to kill Ari Ontawirio. It happened on the 6th night, during a routine equipment check on the dive platform, a length of air hose that should have been sound parted under pressure, 60 feet down, and only Ontawirio's own considerable skill and a fast-thinking tender on the surface line got him back to the platform before the failure became fatal. Lawrence examined the hose himself, in the harsh light of the deck lamps, with an expression I'd not yet seen on him, genuine, unperformed anger. That hose was inspected 2 days ago, he said, turning the frayed end over in his hands. This is not wear. Look, the cut's clean along most of its length, and only frayed at the very end, where it would look like ordinary failure to anyone who didn't examine it closely. Someone weakened this deliberately, and left just enough intact that it would hold until Ari was deep enough for it to matter. Wolfe, informed of the incident the next morning over his customary 2 eggs and a modest portion of Fritz's smoked sausage, listened without visible alarm. It confirms 2 things, he said. First, that our supposition is correct. Someone aboard this vessel has a great deal to lose from whatever surface is in that hold, and is frightened enough to act again so soon after Mr. Decker's death. Second, and more usefully, that Mr. Ontawirio knows something, or is believed to know something, that makes him dangerous to that person? I put the question to Ontario myself that afternoon, on the stern rail, with the brass button catching the light between his fingers. "You think it's about the war," he said. It wasn't a question. "I think it might be." He was quiet. A long moment. "There were men in this coast who worked with the Japanese," he said finally. "Not many. Most who did it because a gun was at a family member's head. And I don't judge those men too hard, not after what I saw those years, but there were a few who did it for gain, for money, for goods, for a soft billet, while the rest of us starved. I knew of one such man in Batavia. Never met him, never knew his face, only knew that a group of men I respected, Dutch and Indonesian both, working together, which was rare enough in those years to be worth respecting on its own, was betrayed to the Kempe Tai in 43, and most of them didn't live to see 45. And you think that man is here?" "I think," Ontario said, "that someone weakened my air hose 2 nights after we opened a hold that was sealed the same year that betrayal happened. And I do not believe in coincidence at the bottom of an ocean, Mr. Goodwin. Coincidence is a luxury for men on dry land." Inspector Reiter of the Netherlands Indies Colonial Police arrived by launch that same afternoon, summoned by Lawrence's wire about the sabotaged hose. And I'll say for him what I came, eventually, to say for most of the men on that barge. He was a professional doing an honest job in a jurisdiction stretched thin by the end of empire, and he did not care for a fat American detective conducting an unofficial investigation aboard a vessel, technically within his authority, and he said so, at some length, standing over Wolfe's deck chair with his hands on his hips, like a man used to being obeyed. "Mr. Wolfe, I have a dead man, and now a sabotaged airline, and I would very much like to close this matter before the monsoon season complicates every salvage permit on this coast. I do not require the assistance of a foreign private detective who has, as far as I can determine, not left that chair since he came aboard." "Inspector," Wolfe said, without opening his eyes more than halfway, "I have not left this chair because I have no need to. Everything I require to solve Mr. Decker's murder is either already aboard this vessel or will be brought to me by Mr. Goodwin, who does the walking so that I need not. I would be obliged if you would grant me perhaps a week before you close your file. A week is a small enough price for the certainty of an accurate conclusion, rather than a convenient one." Reuter did not look pleased, but he also, I noted, did not immediately refuse. And by the time he'd finished his own inspection of the sabotaged hose and Decker's original file, he'd agreed, grudgingly, and with the air of a man who fully expected to regret it, to Wolfe's week. It was that evening that Wolfe finally sent for the Farron crate. Chapter 7. The Manifest That Wasn't. They brought the crate up from the hold on a hand truck, 4 of Lawrence's men sweating under the effort, and set it on the open deck near Wolfe's chair under the awning, in full evening light, with Bregman hovering at its edge with the original manifest clutched to his chest like a man protecting a relic. Wolfe had spent the previous 3 days doing something I hadn't seen him do in years: poring, personally, over shipping tonnage tables, botanical export regulations for the Netherlands Indies, circa 1946, and of all things, a Leiden Herbarium's published correspondence with Aldous Ferrand, portions of which Kessler had cabled across at Wolfe's request. He'd said almost nothing about what he was finding. He said a great deal now. "Mr. Bregman," Wolfe said, "the manifest, if you please, the entry for this crate specifically." Bregman found the page, water-stained, the ink gone soft and spreading at the edges, but legible, and read it aloud. "Botanical specimens, collected by Dr. A. Ferrand, consigned for delivery to the Rijksherbarium at Leiden, gross weight 210 kilograms. 210 kilograms, Wolfe repeated. "Mr. Bregman, you are a records man. I put it to you that a crate of this size, packed with living orchid material in the transport cases customary to the period, moss-lined, ventilated, designed for a voyage of some weeks, together with pressed herbarium specimens and a botanist's field notes, would weigh by any reasonable estimate perhaps 60 to 80 kilograms. I have here." He produced a sheaf of his own notes, and I noted, not for the first time, that Wolfe's handwriting when he is genuinely engaged by a problem becomes almost illegible with speed. Correspondence in which Ferrand himself, writing to Leiden in 1946, describes the transport cases he had commissioned for precisely this shipment and gives their approximate weight when packed. It does not approach 210 kilograms. It does not approach half that figure. The deck was very quiet. Somewhere below, the compressors chugged on, indifferent. Someone, Wolfe continued, added weight to this crate after Ferran packed it, and before it went aboard the Willem Cade, weight substantial enough to more than double the crate's declared contents, and did so under cover of a manifest entry that no customs officer of the period would have thought to question, because who inspects a botanist's orchid crate for contraband? It is, if I may say so, an elegant piece of tradecraft. Whoever devised it understood that the most effective hiding place is the one nobody thinks worth searching. Lawrence, who had come up from the engine room at the crate's arrival and stood now at the edge of the gathered group with his arms crossed, spoke for the first time. "You're saying there's something else in that crate, besides the orchids?" "I am saying it is overwhelmingly probable," Wolfe said. "Mr. Goodwin, if you would open it." I won't pretend my hands were entirely steady doing it. 10 years of salt water does strange things to nailed wood, and I half expected the whole thing to come apart in a shower of rot. But the crate remarkably held together, its interior lined with what had once been a sealed tin liner, itself remarkably intact given its decade at the bottom of the sea. Inside, packed in what remained of moss and paper wrapping gone brown and brittle, were the transport cases Ferran had described, smaller than the crate itself by a considerable margin, exactly as Wolfe had predicted, several of them crushed or waterlogged beyond recognition, but two, remarkably, still sealed, their contents unknown. And beneath them, wedged into the crate's false bottom, in a manner that had clearly been built into the crate's construction rather than added as an afterthought, was a second, smaller tin box, sealed with wax that had somehow held against a decade of seawater, and inside that, I lifted it out myself, into the last of the evening light, while Bregman made a small sound I can only describe as a whimper, a leather ledger, water-damaged but legible, and a single small photograph. Wolfe took the photograph first. He looked at it for a long moment, and then held it out, not to me but to Mrs. Holloway, who had come up onto the deck sometime in the last few minutes, and stood now at the edge of the group with her hand pressed to her mouth. It showed 3 men. One of them, unmistakably, was a younger version of Cornelis Decker. Another, I would learn within the hour, was David Holloway. The third man's face had been deliberately, carefully scratched out of the print, not damaged by water, but scored away with something sharp, in a manner that could only have been done by human hand. "The ledger, Mr. Bregman," Wolfe said. "If you would read it, your Dutch is considerably better than mine, and I suspect what it records will mean more to you than to me, until, that is, you reach the signature." Chapter 8. 6 Guardians, 1 Empty House. I want to step away from the barge for a moment, because while all this was happening, 11,000 miles from West 35th Street, something was happening at the brownstone that I didn't learn about until we were 3 weeks into the case, in a wire from Fritz that reached us via the salvage company's shore office in Balikpapan, and that I think belongs here, in its proper place in the telling, rather than tacked on afterward as an afterthought, because it wasn't an afterthought to the people living through it. Fritz's wire, condensed from what must have been a much longer letter, he'd have preferred to send if the cost of an international cable hadn't forced him into telegram. Brevity, read, as near as I can reconstruct it from memory. Tuesday night man, at front stoop, 2 hours claimed. Lost said he was looking for previous tenant. Dogs would not settle. Loyal at door whole time. Mars would not leave window Apollo. Patrolled until dawn. Called patrolman. He moved along. No trouble since. But wanted you to know Theodore. Says plants fine stop. All well stop miss you. Both stop Fritz. I've since had the fuller version from Fritz himself, told over a meal after we were home, and it went something like this. A man had come to the stoop on a Tuesday evening, 9 days after we'd sailed, and stood there long enough, and awkwardly enough, that Fritz's instincts, honed by 20 years of vetting everyone who came near that door, told him something was wrong before the dogs did. But the dogs told him next, and told him hard. Loyal had come to the door and simply would not leave it, planted himself against the frame with his ears forward and his weight braced, the way he apparently used to stand, Fritz said, in the days right after he'd first arrived at the brownstone, still raw from whatever he'd walked through to get there. Mars had gone to the front window and stayed there, low growl going on nearly continuously, ignoring every attempt Fritz made to call him off. Apollo had simply doubled and redoubled his patrol of the ground floor, checking every window latch twice, 3 times, the way he does when something in the house's rhythm has gone wrong, and he means to find out what before anyone else does. The man on the stoop, when Fritz finally opened the door on the chain and asked his business, claimed to be looking for a previous tenant of the building, gave a name that didn't match any tenant in the building's 40-year history, and left when Fritz told him, politely but with Caesar now visible in the hall behind him, all 75 pounds of controlled authority, that he had the wrong address. The man didn't come back. Fritz called it in to the local patrolman anyway, the way Wolfe would have insisted he do, and nothing more came of it. No second visit, no further sign of anyone with an interest in an empty brownstone, 11,000 miles from wherever its owner had gone. But I think about that Tuesday night sometimes. When I think about this case, Fritz alone at the top of the stairs with a house full of dogs, who'd smelled something wrong in a stranger before any human in the building had worked it out, holding the line on West 35th Street, while on the other side of the world, Wolfe held a different kind of line on a salvage barge. Whether the man on the stoop had anything at all to do with a wreck at the bottom of the Java Sea, I never learned for certain, and Wolfe, when I asked him about it later, gave me only a long look and the observation that a house belonging to a man of Wolfe's habits and reputation attracts a certain quantity of ordinary curiosity, even in the most uneventful weeks, and that 6 trained dogs and 1 vigilant cook were, in his judgment, entirely sufficient to the problem regardless of its cause. I noticed, though, that he read Fritz's wire 3 times before he set it down, and that Loyal's name, when I mentioned the dog's reaction to that stranger, got a longer silence out of Wolfe than anything else in the whole telegram. Chapter 9. Wolfe's Unlikely Deck Chair. Bregman read the ledger by lamplight on the barge's open deck, with the whole company gathered. Lawrence, Ontario, Marsh, Mrs. Holloway, Inspector Reiter, summoned back out by wire, the moment Wolfe indicated he was ready, and Wolfe himself in his deck chair, beer at his elbow, looking for all the world like a man about to review a crossword rather than unmask a murderer. The ledger, it turned out, was a record kept, apparently by the informant himself, in the particular vanity of men who cannot resist documenting their own cleverness, even when the documentation could hang them, of payments received across 1943 and early 1944 for information passed to the Kempeitai regarding the movements and membership of a resistance cell operating out of Batavia. Names, dates, payment in kind, art, antiquities looted from occupied households, small portable wealth that could survive a war and be converted, later, into a comfortable peacetime living, and a final entry, dated early 1947, arranging for the bulk of that payment to be shipped out of the Indies concealed within a botanist specimen crate, booked aboard the Willem Cade, the informant's own hand. It was clear from the entry, having arranged the crate's weight discrepancy personally, understanding exactly what Ferrand's shipment would and would not be searched for. The signature at the ledger's end, faded but legible, read, H. Martens. Hendrik Martens, Wolfe said, into the silence that followed Bregman's reading. Not Lawrence. Lawrence, I am given to understand, was your mother's family name, was it not, sir? The name you adopted sometime in 1946, when you had rather pressing reasons to no longer be found under the name you'd used during the occupation. Lawrence Martens had gone very still, the economical stillness of a man deciding, in real time, whether the moment had come to stop performing calm. That is a serious accusation to make from a water-damaged ledger, he said. It is not an accusation from a ledger alone, Wolfe said. It is corroborated by considerably more. Mr. Ontario's air hose was sabotaged 2 nights after this hold was opened, sabotaged by someone with engineering knowledge sufficient to weaken a line in a manner that would pass casual inspection, which describes precisely one man aboard this vessel with the technical skill and the unsupervised access to have done it. Mr. Decker died in this hold, having gone there, I would suggest, specifically because he had recognized from a photograph, perhaps this very photograph, which I would guess he still carried, as his partner's widow carried a copy of the same picture, that the man running this salvage operation bore an uncomfortable resemblance to a face he had spent a decade trying to forget. He confronted you. You could not afford to let that confrontation reach Inspector Rota or Mrs. Holloway or anyone with the standing to ask further questions, and so you struck him, in this hold, with something a great deal more deliberate than an accidental fall against an iron table corner. The wound, I am given to understand from the inspector's own report, sat too high, and too centered on the skull for a stumbling fall to easily produce, and far more consistent with a blow delivered by someone standing over him. "This is speculation," Martin said, but his voice had lost the flat control it had carried through every previous conversation I'd had with him. "It is speculation resting on a foundation of very solid fact," Wolfe said. "The ledger exists, the signature exists, the manifest discrepancy exists, and was constructed by someone with precisely the knowledge you possess of both shipping documentation and the botanical hold's exact contents. Knowledge that, I would note, none of the others aboard this vessel could plausibly claim, since none of them arranged this salvage operation's manifest access before the wreck was even located. And you, Mr. Martins, have spent 10 years since 1946, since the moment you understood the war's end meant a reckoning might eventually come for men who profited from betrayal, building a new name, a legitimate trade, a reputation as a skilled and trusted salvage engineer, precisely so that when the Willem Cade was inevitably found, as wrecks eventually are, you would be the man best positioned to control what came up from her hold, and to make certain that one small ledger never resurfaced to attach itself to your name." The silence that followed was long enough that I could hear the compressors below, and the water against the hull, and somewhere, absurdly, a bird calling from the Bornean shore. "He recognized me," Martin said finally, quietly, "to no one in particular. 12 years. I changed my name. I changed my trade. I never went near Batavia again if I could help it, and he still recognized me from a photograph he'd carried in his wallet for over a decade. The moment he saw me clearly in decent light. I didn't plan it. I want that understood. I came out here to run a salvage job, nothing more. The debt on that ship was 10 years dead as far as I was concerned, until he stood in that hold and said my name, my real name, and I understood, in that moment, that everything I'd built since 1946 was over, unless I did something about it." "And so you did something about it," Wolfe said, without heat. "Twice, once to Mr. Decker, and once when it appeared Mr. Ontario's memory of the wartime betrayal might lead him, or someone, back toward the truth, to an air hose 60 feet below this deck." Inspector Reuter, who had listened to the whole exchange with his hands loosely on his hips, and his eyes never leaving Martins's face, stepped forward at last and said something in Dutch that I didn't need translated to understand was an arrest. Chapter 10. Homeward, and the Orchids waiting. The 2 sealed transport cases from the Ferrand crate were opened, at last in the shade of the barge's awning, with Wolfe himself supervising the operation from his deck chair with an attentiveness I hadn't seen him direct at anything, work-related or otherwise, in longer than I cared to count. One case had failed somewhere along the way, whether from the original sinking or the decade since, there was no telling, and its contents came out as little more than sodden, unsalvageable pulp, at which Wolfe's face went through an expression I choose to describe only as disciplined. The second case had held. I won't pretend to have understood in any technical sense what Wolfe found inside it, because botanical Latin has never been a language I've troubled to learn, but I understood his face well enough, and I understood the long silence that followed as he examined by the light of a hand lamp. Ontario held steady for him, a handful of desiccated but recognizably intact plant material, and a slim, water-stained field notebook in a careful, cramped European hand, its final pages given over to sketches and Latin notes that Wolfe read the way another man might read a will that named him sole heir to a fortune. "Well?" I said, when I couldn't stand it any longer. "It is Ferrand's genus," Wolfe said, very quietly, in a voice I had genuinely never heard him use before, not once in 20 years, over a body or a bottle of wine or anything else. "It is real, Archie. It survived. And the notebook is complete enough that between this material and the description recorded here, formal classification is entirely possible." He closed the notebook with the care of a man closing something considerably more fragile than paper. "I believe," he added, after a moment, in a tone that made a visible effort to return to its usual register and did not entirely succeed, "that I shall have some correspondence to conduct with Leiden." Inspector Reiter took Martins off the barge that same evening, in irons, under a sky gone the particular violent orange of an equatorial sunset. And I noted that none of the men aboard, not Ontario, not Bregman, not even Lawrence's own crew, who'd worked under the man for months without knowing what he'd once been, seemed inclined to say much of anything, as the launch pulled away, as though the whole barge had exhaled at once, and found it had nothing much to say into the silence that followed. Margit Holloway found Wolfe at the rail that last evening, the second time, by my count, that I'd seen him voluntarily near open water on this entire voyage, and thanked him with a directness that seemed, finally, to have shed the careful composure she'd worn since Sutton Place. David would have wanted to know, she said. Not the ending, maybe, but that someone finally asked the question he never let himself ask out loud. Grief asks its own questions in its own time. Madam, Wolfe said, I have merely supplied an answer it had been waiting rather too long to receive. We sailed for New York 3 days later, the Ferrand notebook and its surviving specimens, packed by Wolfe's own exacting instruction into a travel case he did not let out of arm's reach for the entire 6-week crossing, refusing even Saul's offer to spell him watching over it during the Atlantic leg. I'll say this for the return voyage, Wolfe complained about the mattress a great deal less. He did not, however, complain any less about the general unreasonableness of an ocean that insisted on moving. We reached the Brownstone on a Wednesday morning in September, and I want to tell you about the last 5 minutes of that trip because I think they're worth telling properly. The car turned onto West 35th Street, a little after 9, and Diana, who must have caught the sound of the engine or some scent carried ahead on the morning air, before any of us were visible from the house, was at the front window before we'd even come to a stop at the curb, and by the time I had the car door open, the front door of the Brownstone was open too, Fritz standing in it, with an expression that undid every careful, unbothered word he'd put into 6 weeks of telegrams. And past him, pouring down the stoop in a controlled, disciplined rush that only just avoided chaos, came all 6 of them at once. Caesar reached Wolfe first, the way an alpha reaches anything first, with a gravity that somehow managed to convey both proper household order and genuine, unrestrained relief in the same motion. Mars came in hard behind him, circling once as though to confirm for himself that the man standing on his own stoop was really, actually, finally home. Apollo did a single fast circuit of the whole group before settling. Patrol complete, threat assessed as none. Minerva approached more slowly, the way she approaches everything, and simply leaned her weight against Wolfe's leg and stayed there, watching his face with the particular stillness of a dog, taking careful inventory of a thing she'd worried might not come back. Loyal got there last, not because he was slow, but because he'd apparently been waiting just inside the door with Fritz, and when he came through it, he went straight past all the others, straight to Wolfe, and simply pressed himself against him with his whole body, the way he must once have pressed himself against a 200-mile road, and stayed there, while Wolfe, I choose not to describe his face in any detail, because Wolfe would not thank me for it, and because a man is entitled to at least a few private moments even from the friend who's writing his story, put a hand down and left it resting on the dog's head for considerably longer than the operation strictly required. Well, Wolfe said finally, straightening with some effort, addressing the assembled household. Dogs, cook, and doorstep, all with the particular gruffness he reserves for moments that have moved him more than he intends to admit. It appears the house has survived my absence. The house, Fritz said, was never the one I worried about, sir. Wolfe made a small sound that might, in a lesser man, have been mistaken for something close to laughter, and went inside. Fritz's homecoming dinner that evening was, by unanimous and unspoken agreement, the best meal any of us had eaten in 6 weeks, a burgundy stew that had clearly been planned and refined in Wolfe's absence with the single-minded devotion of a man determined to prove that no salvage barge galley on earth could compete with a proper kitchen, though I did notice, in passing through the kitchen that afternoon, a duck resting in the cold box that never once made an appearance at the table, and which Fritz, when I raised an eyebrow at it, informed me with great dignity was, "For tomorrow's stock, Archie, and none of your business besides." Wolfe was back among his orchids by 9 the following morning, and I found him there at 11, standing before the Cattleya with the Ferrand notebook open on the potting bench beside him, cross-referencing something in its cramped European hand against a reference volume Theodore had fetched down at his request. "You're really going to name it?" I said. "Ferrand did the naming," Wolfe said without looking up. "I intend only to see that the naming is honored, that his genus enters the record under his authorship, 10 years late and by a considerably stranger road than he could have anticipated, but honored nonetheless." He turned a brittle page with the particular care he'd shown it every day since the Java Sea. "There is, Archie, something to be said for the notion that even the dead may finish what they started, provided someone is willing to go and fetch it for them." even if that someone has to get on a boat to do it. He gave me a long look over the top of the notebook, the look he reserves for observations he considers accurate, unwelcome, and beneath the dignity of a direct reply, and said nothing at all, which I took, after 20 years of reading that particular silence, as the closest thing to an admission I was ever going to get. Loyal, who had followed us up to the plant rooms and settled himself in the one patch of floor, Wolfe permitted a dog to occupy among the odontoglossum, gave a small contented sigh, and put his chin down on his paws, and outside the glass, the September light lay warm and ordinary, and entirely gratefully unmoving across a street that, for the first time in 6 weeks, had every one of its people exactly where they belonged.